You mentioned your PhD research, and I wonder if you could just sort of share some of the insights you noticed between Kenyan, East African at least, as far as I can remember, and British runners in terms of the intensities that they were undertaking some of their race pace simulation work. I thought this was a
Yeah.
fascinating result, whether it still stacks up, but it probably tells a tale, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, this is going back quite a long way now.
I'm
If I can
testing you now on
remember,
your own
I
PhD.
know. Yeah, if I can remember rightly. Yeah, they were actually completing some of their high intensity training during the taper a significantly faster pace than race pace, whereas
So
our
this is the
athletes
Kenyans.
the Kenyans, yeah. So they were we looked at the training diaries of long distance runners, so 5K and 10K, and they were running significantly faster during the taper than our runners were relative to race pace. I'm just trying to think back to the study now, but there were some intricacies around training volume and how much they were reducing compared to us. But that kind of sparked that initial thought with me during my PhD is, are we missing a trick here? Are we actually needing to increase the intensity further or train at higher intensity during the taper to really get that stimulus or physiological priming of sorts before the race? So really exposing the body to what it's going to expect in the race and beyond. Can we do that by manipulating the training volume, as I said before, in the early parts of the taper to allow us to then tolerate that, recover from it, but actually use it as a form of priming.
Have you made any observations about when people haven't necessarily tapered very well, and then you've given them something that's slightly more optimal or science-based, and if there are any real differences that happen?
Yeah, so there was that situation in one of my PhD studies where we had a couple of athletes who were a good standard of athlete. Were regular performers on the middle distance circuit, but hadn't actually implemented an optimal taper to the level of what the literature was suggesting. And when we conducted the performance trial, we found that they adopted a positive pacing strategy, which is what we'd expect in a middle distance performance. But actually, instead of opting for a fast start and then slowing a little bit towards the end of a race, but still improving performance, they actually implemented an over fast start so that it was too fast for the level of fitness that they could actually tolerate towards the end of the race, and they actually ended up running slower after a taper than before. And when we spoke to those individuals, it became clear that they hadn't implemented an optimal taper before, and that the feeling of freshness was almost heightened to a level that they couldn't control that pacing strategy, particularly in the experimental study where they weren't getting any time feedback. So my recommendation would be to athletes who are a bit more unfamiliar with an optimal taper is to really pay attention to the split times early in a race, particularly if you've got a watch or there's a clock. Depends obviously the sport that you're in, but making sure that you're not going out too fast because you're feeling so fresh, because it will come back to bite you later on in the race. And I've definitely heard in some other sports as well where athletes are so used to training under fatigue, particularly in a sport like gymnastics, for example, where they're completing a skill day in day out under a certain level of fatigue, and when you remove that, it actually changes the feeling of completing that skill. So actually maybe for them, not tapering quite so much might be more beneficial for performance.
That's so interesting, and probably does reinforce that idea of needing to practice, or at least know that that might be a thing that they're going to experience, and regulate that for optimal pacing performance.
especially when you're in that competitive environment where you're more motivated to achieve something. You're alongside your opponents, and you that excitement and adrenaline starts flowing when the gun goes, that you have to really just hold yourself back and make sure you stick to the race plan.
What's your interpretation of why perhaps the Brits were pulling back a little bit there? Have we got this sort of an intoxicating, steady mix here of perhaps doing too much volume, not enough intensity, because we're conservative, we don't want to lose at that sort of base, but not actually provide our preparation for the competition itself? What's your interpretation of that?
I think potentially, it could be that the Kenyans in their sort of lower intensity, continuous type running are operating at a much lower intensity. So, there's much more
Okay.
polarization to their training perhaps than our athletes in those event groups. Again, it'd be difficult to interpret without some further information, but that could be potentially the reason that there's just more polarization for them.